Okay, chapter 28. The book opens up with another big net about racism, about Fannie Lou Hamer tried to register to vote in Mississippi, again the same state where Emmett Till was killed. And she had to go against a growing conservative movement, the conservatives being blamed for all the racism in their country. But not only were blacks, but other people were demanding their rights too. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer grew up a black, poor woman. Then your book compares her to another person, John Kennedy, who grew up a rich white man. Opposites. But eventually the two of them got to learn about each other. I don't know if they ever actually met or not. Kennedy grew up privileged. Roosevelt called his the New Deal. Truman called his the Fair Deal. Kennedy was to call his the New Frontier. He said, we've always had a frontier. Well, we've used up all of our land frontier, but we need a new frontier. Basically, that new frontier was socialism, pure and simple. I mean, folk. There was a popular song at the time, "Oh, Kennedy, we need that new frontier so I can buy me a rocking chair." All right, now, a little bit of background on Kennedy. Kennedy was born with Addison's disease, which meant he had a chronic problem with his back. As such, he should not have ever been allowed into the Army, but he lied, and I want to tell you, he lied to get in, folk. I'm going to hand that to him. He lied to get in. A lot of men will try to lie to get out, but in his case, he lied about his physical condition to get in the Army. But when World War II broke out, he was there in England, helping, he was an officer along with his brother. His father was the ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy wanted to be president himself, but Joseph Kennedy loused up in his politics badly. Joseph Kennedy pushed hard for peace with Hitler. And when that movement fell, Joseph Kennedy became permanently unpopular and never had a chance to become president. So out the window went Joseph Kennedy's chances, but he wanted his son, so he groomed his oldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., to be president. Instead, his younger son, his second son, John, got to be president. Now, John Kennedy wound up going halfway around the world to fight against the Japanese. At first, he'd been opposing the Germans. He went to fight against the Japanese. Why did he have to leave England? Well, he was caught having a sexual liaison with a woman whose picture was seen photographed standing next to Adolf Hitler. Basically, he was having a liaison with a German woman, which in World War II was enough to get him court-martialed and kicked out of the army for good. But his father arranged to where he could be quietly shipped out. The FBI, then led by Director J. Edgar Hoover, had ordered that a tape recorder be placed under Kennedy's bed. Kennedy, being an officer, had his own private room. And then they would sneak into his room when they knew he wasn't there, pick up the tape recorder and listen to the tapes. Or rather, pick up the tape and listen to the tapes and put a new tape down to catch him in a conversation again if one would occur. He never gave this woman any secrets, maybe because he didn't know any. But he went off to fight against the Japanese, and he was in a PT boat. A Japanese warship struck his PT boat on purpose and cut it in two. Kennedy was able to swim to an island nearby, where a week later he was picked up. But because he had saved his entire crew, he became a war hero of sorts. His older brother died. Joseph had outdone John in everything. I mean, there was sibling rivalry. His older brother was jealous of all the attention that young John was getting. I mean, an admiral visited John, and the President of the United States wrote him a letter and all this stuff. And his older brother slipped, stole a plane, and took off in one of an airplane, intending to fly a secret mission to bomb some of his installation in Germany without permission. He was spotted by American and British radar, who had no idea what that plane was doing. They assumed it was an enemy, because no British plane was supposed to have left. So they shot him down. That was the end of Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. So then his father tried to groom young John to the presidency using his heroics in the war. And John became a member of the House of Representatives. Then he became a member of the Senate. He and Richard Nixon became buddies for a while they're in the Senate together. Then Nixon became vice president, and he and Senator Kennedy were still friends somewhat. If you know, the vice president is in charge of the Senate. Well, in 1960, the two men ran against each other. Richard Nixon probably won the 1960 election. But Joseph Kennedy, who had ties with the mafia and ties with the underworld and ties with the mob, managed to get a few votes in the Chicago district turned. We now know that Joseph Kennedy once said to his young son John, "I'm not going to buy you a landslide. I'm going to buy you the election." John Kennedy won by the barest of margins. If Richard Nixon would have wanted a recount, perhaps the election would have gone to Nixon. However, Kennedy knew some dirt on Nixon. And if any of you studied Nixon, had quite a bit of dirt. It's like the two men came to a gentleman's agreement. I won't tell on you if you don't tell on me. Kennedy didn't tell on Nixon. Nixon didn't tell on Kennedy. Kennedy got to be president. Now, one reason he got to be president was he ran with his running mate, a very popular man in the South named Johnson. Johnson, who was a big vote getter in the South, and a lot of persons know that thanks to Johnson, Kennedy became president. Without Johnson, Kennedy did not have a chance. And once Kennedy had won the election, he put Johnson on the shelf, and for a long time we never heard from President Johnson again. Even a Beta Bailey comic said that is true. We don't hear from our vice president anymore. No, we didn't. And I remember my 8th grade teacher, we don't hear from the vice president anymore. That was true. John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did not like each other. That was a shame. All right, here is Kennedy. If he would have used Johnson, I mean, keep in mind, Johnson was now head of the Senate. Johnson knew how to get legislation passed. Johnson knew how to get things done. Kennedy is judged negatively for two reasons. Number one is Bay of Pigs, we'll talk about in a minute. And number two, he could not get his legislation passed, his New Frontier legislation. He got up federal aid, couldn't get it, federal aid to education, couldn't get it passed. He got up Medicare for the aged, which I'm on right now, couldn't get it passed. Got up the Civil Rights Act, couldn't get it passed. Couldn't get anything done, hardly. Very little, in fact. He got up a tax cut. Johnson got it passed. All this stuff Johnson was to get passed later. But the first thing that happened with Kennedy, the first significant thing, was the Bay of Pigs fiasco. I've already mentioned how that Eisenhower was training Cuban people to go in and take over Cuba. Okay. Well, Ike left office warning the country of the danger of big military-industrial complex. Anyway, Ike left office. It was up to Kennedy to decide whether they invaded or not, so Kennedy told the people who were training in Miami, go ahead and invade Cuba, land at the Bay of Pigs, and I will support you with air support once you get it landed. And we believe that the Cuban people will be glad to see an enemy army invade, and they will come to your aid right away, and they'll rush and they'll be happy to see you there. The riffraff, I'm not going to call it army, the riffraff landed on the Bay of Pigs. Castro with his army surrounded them. The people of Cuba did not rush to the aid of the invaders, and Kennedy did not give the invaders air support. From that day till this, the Cubans living in Miami hate John Kennedy. The people who took part in the Bay of Pigs were rounded up and put in a prison. I really don't know what eventually happened to them. Maybe they eventually got out. But between the Bay of Pigs and he couldn't get his legislation passed, Kennedy has gotten somewhat of a bad name. Now, you might have heard that Kennedy was a womanizer. Folk, we did not find that out until 1967, 4 years after the man died. That's when it began to come out. even though it's been said everybody in Washington knew it. But nobody told. The press knew it, and the press didn't say anything. Because everybody in the Senate and the House knew it. Nobody said a word. You might say, isn't the president protecting the Secret Service? Yes, but the Secret Service was told by Kennedy himself, if you know that my wife is not around and some pretty girl starts to walk into my room, you're to let her through. If this sounds sick, I'm sorry. I know I'm I'm just telling the way it happened. They would let her through. And the Secret Service, we wondered, terribly worried, what if she's sent to assassinate him? Or what kind of secrets might she be collecting? Now, there was a woman named Ellen Romsch who is known to have been an East German, a communist. She went into Kennedy's room more than once. And the Senate, on November 1963, the Senate was debating what should be done. I mean, we did not know this years later. But while Kennedy was being shot dead, the Senate was in a secret session debating what should be done about John Kennedy and Ellen Romsch. Well, Robert Kennedy, the brother, finally gave Ellen Romsch a one-way plane ticket back to Germany. And Ellen knew if she didn't take it, she could expect something to happen to her. She took it, and she's been quiet ever since. By now, she might be dead of old age. But she kept her mouth shut. What kind of secrets he might have revealed to her, we may never know. All right, but anyway, during Kennedy's term in office, the worst crises that we faced occurred, called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one hand, Kennedy himself did not really cause this crisis. And if anything, of all the bad stuff you can say about Kennedy, the one thing he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis might have redeemed, I had people say, he might have redeemed every bad deed he ever did. He kept us away from war and negotiated a treaty one time, a treaty that has lasted to this day. He was urged by the generals, we've got to go to war. Here's the story. A U-2 plane photographed missile shapes in Cuba. Reported, and the experts looked for us, there's the missiles in Cuba. The Soviets, so Kennedy sent a note to the premier, you've got to get your missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev said, well, you have missiles in Turkey. Well, we've had them there, you've known about them all along, but you are putting missiles in a new place, you've got to get them out. So Kennedy ordered a blockade around Cuba, and folks, this became as close as we got to war, the nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy put a blockade. Robert got to negotiating, and eventually negotiated a treaty where that we agreed to pull, a secret treaty, we agreed to secretly pull our missiles out of Turkey, and in turn the Soviets pulled their missiles out of Cuba. Now I had a pupil tell me one time, but I feel like if my country's doing this, I should know they can't keep secrets. I said, well, you've got to wake up to the world in the world of reality. Our government makes secret deals and does secret things that we won't find out about till later. It's the way it is. And again, I'm not going to fault the Kennedy brothers for negotiating this secret treaty. It has saved us from nuclear holocausts, and we're here today because we did not have to fight a nuclear war in the 1960s. Again, Nixon said if I had been president, I would have invaded Cuba. The man might have done it. But Nixon was not the president at that time. This Cuban Missile Crisis passed on like the others did. In November of 1963, Kennedy felt his popularity slipping. He was falling in the polls. And he all of a sudden realized, hey, I really need Johnson. I really need Johnson. So he got with his Vice President Johnson. They went to Texas to try to shore up the popularity. He felt if I carry Johnson along, and while he was motorcading in Dallas, Texas, something today's presidents, by the way, do not do, he had a car that was a convertible, no top on. He was shot dead while motorcading in Dallas, while going under Neely Plaza. There have been more than 200 books written about the incident, but I want to run through you some things that I think are fascinating. to compare Nixon's death and Kennedy's death, to compare Lincoln's death with Kennedy's. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. The assassins of both Lincoln and Kennedy are known by three names: John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. Add up those names, it comes out to 13 letters apiece. The two men were born in the same year except 100 years apart, I believe 1839 and 1939. Lincoln was killed on a Friday, Kennedy was killed on a Friday. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were shot in the back of their head. Both of them had their wives beside them when they were shot. Both of them had vice presidents named Johnson. Lincoln was killed in Ford Theater. Kennedy was killed in a Lincoln that was built by Ford. Now, we do know Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. We were told for many years that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, but we researched and we found out, no, Lincoln did not have a secretary named Kennedy. That has to go by the wayside. We tried to find it, but in those days, most secretaries were men. I think all of Lincoln's secretaries were men. He had a team on them, but none of them named Kennedy. But anyway, Kennedy did have a secretary named Lincoln. And Mrs. Lincoln was going to expose all the corruption she saw, and then he died, and she held off writing her book for several years. But she was going to expose the womanizing and other stuff. She was going to quit it, basically, and tell the country what kind of man he was. But she finally did. Anyway, Johnson became president, and in a very short time, he got all the legislation passed that Kennedy got. A tax cut passed, which improved the economy. He got Medicare passed, which is still on the books, even though it's bankrupt. He got federal aid to education, and its education went downhill from then on, but that's something else. He got the Civil Rights Act passed. And the Civil Rights Act, not just was beneficial to blacks, but for women also. It enacted to outlaw discrimination based on race and gender. All this, and then Johnson was elected by an overwhelming majority in 1964 with a promise: if elected, I will keep us out of Vietnam. While all the time he was planning to get deeper and deeper involved. It's called the Credibility Act, which we'll talk more about now. Okay, time is